All right, so today we're going to continue talking about evolution and the theory of evolution, which just says all species have originated from a pre-existing ancestral species. And right now we're focusing on evidence. So in order for something to be a scientific theory, we have to have a lot of data and a lot of evidence to back that up. Okay, so last week we went over the first 6 pieces of evidence. So again, we used the fossil record, transitional fossils, comparative anatomy, homologous structures, vestigial structures, and comparative embryology. So today we're going to move forward. We're going to talk about comparative biochemistry. So comparative just means comparing, so finding similarities and differences. And then when we look at the word biochemistry, what does bio mean? Life. And then what do you think of when you hear chemistry? Chemicals. So we're going to look at the chemicals involved in living things. And so it turns out common ancestry can be seen in the complex metabolic molecules that many different organisms share in common. So, for example, a very popular one is called cytochrome C. This is an enzyme. It's essential for respiration. And so think back to first semester. Do you remember when we talked about photosynthesis and respiration?
Yeah.
Okay, respiration is just the process where you take energy from your food and your body converts it into the usable ATP energy. And so the enzyme cytochrome C is involved in those chemical reactions. And it turns out that over time, it's changed very little. And so we can look at cytochrome C and we can compare it in different animals. And we can see how closely related those animals are or how distantly related they are. So the second half today, we'll start that cytochrome C lab, and I'll show you how do we use cytochrome C as evidence. So when we look at biochemistry, we can also look at DNA, and we can compare the DNA of different species, and we can use that to establish evolutionary relationships. And when I say evolutionary relationships, I just mean how closely are 2 species related or how distant those 2 species are. And then if you look up here at this diagram, this is called a cladogram. So it's just a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships. We are going to construct one of these together after notes, but just like a really general high overview, the closer 2 animals are on this, the more closely related they are. The further they are, the more distant they are in relation. All right, so let's recall back to our DNA unit. So our previous unit, so remember DNA codes for RNA, and then RNA codes for proteins, and remember amino acids make up proteins. So we can say that the genetic code, or DNA, is just coding for proteins. And it turns out that it's universal in all organisms. So proteins are made up of amino acids. And all living things are made up of different combinations of the same 20 amino acids. So we can also look at either the composition of DNA, or we can look at our amino acid compositions to compare how closely related 2 different species are. So for example, if we just look at the composition of DNA, so the order of the base pairs, like the A's, the T's, the C's, and the G's. If we compare humans, all of our DNA is 99.9% the same. If we compare us to chimps, there's only a 1.6% difference, which means 98.4% of our DNA is the same as chimps. If we compare ourselves to something less closely related, like a dog, what do you think happens to the percent of DNA that we share? It's going to go down. Okay, so the more closely related you are to a different species, the higher the percent of DNA is going to be the same. The more distant your relation is, the lower that number is going to be. All right, this slide you don't need to write down since I don't have any bolded words, but I just want to talk a little bit more about biochemistry. So molecules in a species with a recent common ancestor should share certain amino acid sequences, okay? Meaning you're going to have more similar DNA. DNA is going to end up coding for RNA, and then RNA is going to code for those amino acids. Okay? So the more closely related species are, the greater the number of shared sequences. And then finally, I'm just going to throw in an 8th piece of evidence. It is not related to the biochemistry, but it's just one slide on its own, and I wasn't sure where to fit it. And today we didn't have very many slides, so I'm just going to fit it in today's. So an 8th piece of evidence to support evolution is biogeography. So biogeography is just like where living species are. Okay. And it turns out evolution is linked with climate and other geological forces, especially plate tectonics. What is plate tectonics? Yeah, what do your tectonic plates do? Good. They shift. At one point in time, they were all merged together in one single mass. What did we call that one single mass? Good, Pangea. Over time, they've been spreading out. So here's an example of camels, okay, in the camel family, so camels and llamas. So we think camels originated in Northern America, and this is way back during the Pleistocene era. Over time, they've been able to migrate. So back then, you could walk just from North America to Europe, so they could migrate over to Europe, Africa, Asia, okay, the Middle East. Also, North and South America were connected, so they could migrate to South America. And so we can see how the ancestors of camels migrated a long time ago, and then since then they became isolated, and that they've evolved different adaptations or different traits, right? So in Africa, you get a one-hump camel. In the Middle East, you get a two-hump camel. In South America, you have a llama. But we think they all stemmed from a common ancestor that originated in North America.